and let's get started. So we're first going to start with a quick spiel about what the Maine Tree Farm Program is. We are hosting this webinar, and we are doing that in partnership with some of the local soil and water conservation districts, and then our obviously lovely presenter, Joe. And so people coming here may not know what tree farm is. So we are the sign of good forestry. If you see that diamond logo that's in the top corner of your screen, that's us. And if you see that out on someone's property, you know that they're managing their woodlot in a responsible, sustainable manner. I always say this at the end, so I'm going to say it at the beginning. We are a free program to be a part of. We don't have any annual dues or membership fees associated with us, and our mission is to help Maine family woodland owners sustainably manage your woodlots. And we do that by helping you wherever you are in what we call your stewardship storyline. And so, whether you're a new landowner, you just inherited your property, you've had it in the family forever, or you've owned that same piece of property for forever, we're here to connect you with resources and industry professionals and information and also community. So, the not drawback. We do have requirements to be a part of our program. So we're free, but we do ask a couple things of you. Our first requirement is that you have at least 10 acres of wooded land. There are some provisions that allow for the 10 acres to be partially ag, include a house lot and things like that. It is case by case, but we can talk you through your specific circumstance as needed. The second requirement, we ask that you have a written forest management plan that aligns with our sustainability standards. And this can be written by a consulting forester or yourself. It just has to align with our 8 sustainability standards, which revolve around our 4 values of wood, water, wildlife, and recreation. Um, the management plan does have to be based, on the best available science, and so we do ask that a consulting forester sign off on your forest management plan if you write it yourself. And then the last requirement is once you're in our program, we ask you sustainably manage your land for those 4 values that I just listed, and we check to make sure you do. We have a what's unfortunately called an inspection process, but it's not us going to your woodlot and, scrutinizing your decisions. It is a inspecting forester who's been trained through our program doing a walk and talk with you on your property. And that walk and talk is free. Um, to you as the landowner, we provide a stipend to our foresters for doing that walk and talk, and they're there making sure that what you put in your management plan matches our standards, and then what you're doing on the ground in your woodlot matches what's in your forest management plan. And if there's for some reason, something that makes you not check all the boxes, the forester there will give you, recommendations for how you can meet our standards, and we can talk next steps about that as well. So super simple. We don't ask a lot, but we give a lot. So what do we offer you? I group it by 4 different categories. We first and foremost are a recognition program. So we recognize landowners who do, amazing stewardship. And so to recognize our landowners, you receive the iconic tree farm sign, a personalized nameplate with your family name, personal name, farm name on it, and you get a certificate of recognition from our program saying that your woodlot is a tree farm. You also receive informational benefits. So we send out monthly e-newsletters, biannual print newsletters. We're developing our website to have a robust online resource bank that will be completely free to access. And then our biggest perk for information is access to those industry and resource professionals through people like our inspecting foresters. Our network is vast, and we're happy to connect you with the people that we know. Another perk is community, and that it comes through with opportunities for you as the landowner to share and connect with other like-minded landowners. And we do this by offering different tree farm events, whether that's in person or virtual. So you have the opportunity to connect with people from York County to Aroostook County. And I think that's something that's pretty unique. The last, well, maybe not the last, but the last one that we'll talk about right now, uh, benefit is validation. So, along with recognition, we validate that the management that you're doing on your property meets internationally recognized standards. And so, you can rest assured that what you're doing on your property is responsible, it's sustainable, and it's based on the best available science, which is incredibly valuable to a lot of people. All right. So that was the very short spiel because I know you're not here to listen to me talk. So I will invite Joe if he wants to pop on up, and I'll let him take it from here. And if you have any questions about anything I said, I'll put my contact at the end of this whole webinar, and you can reach out to me and we can connect one-on-one. But yeah, thanks for listening, and I will mute myself and let Joe take it away.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm glad you could join the webinar here. Um, can folks see the screen?
Yes.
Casey, can you see? Good. There we go. So, by way of introduction, my name is Joe Dembeck. I live in Skowhegan, Maine. Um, I kind of grew fascinated with apple trees when I was very young. My father and I used to maintain wild trees in my grandparents' old farm, which was behind our house. And it was mainly for wildlife. We did a little bit of fresh eating off the trees, but we learned by experience going to the library. We didn't have any known pruners around us or apple orchards near us in the Catskills, so in New York. So, it was trial and error. But my whole life, I've always been curious about maintaining apple trees, pruning them, improving the quality of the fruit that you have on those trees. And it's kind of led, me into where I am now, um, where I prune apple trees during this time of year and teach workshops. And today I was asked to provide just a pretty basic primer on apple trees in your woodlands. We could spend a day or two on subjects, individual subjects like grafting, pruning, uh, rejuvenating old apple trees, how to plant new trees, and everything. But today is just going to touch on a lot of those subjects and, let you folks ask questions near the end here. So, what we have here is everybody's goal, right? This beautiful shaped tree, lots of fruit, everything looks perfect. Call it the Garden of Eden view or your local apple orchard view. In reality, this is what most of us have on our property. Trees that are mostly wild trees that have been neglected, are getting crowded by other vegetation, are, leaning into the sunlight, so to say, from field edges and openings in woods or tote roads. And this is what a lot of us have to work with uh, in our woodlands. So, just quickly about apple trees, just some very basic information. So, for fruiting to occur, you need cross pollination between varieties. So, if you had a whole orchard of just Macintosh trees, you'd have very low level of fruit production. But if you have other varieties involved, you usually have very high level of fruit production because of this hybridization effect. Um, the fruit is true to the tree, but the seeds are not. So you have a Macintosh tree, say, in your yard that was planted by your grandparents in the 1930s. Um, every fruit on that tree is probably a hybrid, depending upon what it's been pollinated with, be it other trees around your house, from your neighbor's trees, or farther in the woods. And that's where you're going to find the differences in the seeds. So if you took each of those fruits, you had endless amount of time and area, and planted those seeds, and they germinated, you'd have all different kinds of trees that would bear different types of fruit. There are a few exceptions to this. There are some very old varieties of apple trees that will bear fruit, and those seeds will be very similar to the parent tree. And these varieties, if you look them up, are mostly French and British because these were found to be similar to the propagation was similar to the trees that variety that the fruit was formed on. And they would carry these around a lot through exploration. Um, Timing of pollination, of course, is in the spring. And one aspect of that that is really important is you want trees that have a bloom for a longer period of time mixed in with certain varieties that have short bloom periods. So one example here I put is crabapple varieties. An example is Dolgo. It's a Russian variety of crabapple. For those of you that are familiar with it, it's this beautiful oval shaped, dark purple fruit, has a very long bloom period in the spring, blooms every spring. So it's an excellent pollinating tree. And it also is a decent enough sized fruit where you can get 5 or 6 bites out of the apple when it's ripe, and it makes awesome applesauce because it's purplish in color, the flesh. Um, Another aspect just for you to consider is pollinators are really drawn to apple trees. And in the Northeast, we have about 450 known bee species. And studies of recent have shown that at least 100 of those bee species um, pollinate apple trees and are drawn to apple trees for pollination. Grafting is a method that's used to maintain varieties nowadays. So anything you would buy, say from Fedco or other suppliers of apple tree rootstock or seedlings, commercial orchards use this, is the root system itself is a different variety based upon the size of the tree that you want, be it a dwarf, semi-dwarf, or standard, which is a full-size tree. But what's grafted on that scion wood is going to be the variety of apples that you want. So this is how you maintain fruit types so that you get exactly what you want for eating quality and purposes. As many of you are familiar with, apples ripen anywhere from, I'd say, even late July, August through October, early November. It's really based upon the variety and the climate that you're at. Um, and we can often identify what type of tree is planted around a house, say it's a planted tree, by how close it is to a house. One perfect example is yellow transparent. It's a very popular tree in the Northeast, especially Maine. It's a very late summer, one of your first trees to ripen. So say early August, mid-August. And typically it was planted very close to farmhouses, near the kitchen door, within sight of the house, because the apples, once they're ripe, only last for maybe 3 to 5, 6 days before they turn to mush. But just think of it back in the day when you didn't have the ability to go to a grocery store and get apples from all over the world that to me are tasteless this time of year or in the summer. That first apple tree that produced fruit that you could eat was really important, and a lot of it was made into applesauce or fresh eating. And going along those lines, when you're reading about apple varieties, there's different terminology that's used. So you've got apples that are for pies, so baking apples, um, either baked by themselves or baked in a pie setting or a tart setting. What's called a dessert apple is actually what's a fresh eating apple described. A lot of older books will describe varieties as dessert, but it's actually those that you would eat fresh. Cooking apples would be you'd use those in minces, could be used for making sauces, which a lot of them can do, and cider, of course, which was hugely important 100 years ago and before that, both fresh cider for drinking, but more importantly, hard cider production. And then one thing to consider when you have apple trees on your property is a really simple method for testing the eating quality of those if you don't know the variety. And even wild trees will taste well. Some of them taste awful. But I call it the CRISPR method. You got a tree in your yard, you're uncertain how good a quality it is for eating or for cooking or making sauce. Grab a bunch of apples when they seem ripe, put them in a brown paper bag, and put them in one of your crisper doors in your fridge. And if you're lucky enough to have a root cellar or a cold area in a basement or a barn that rodents won't get around and insects, you can store it there. But just write on it where those apples came from, grab 12, 15, and the date. And then about once a week, try one. What it feels like, take a bite out of it. Um, you might find out you have 5 or 6 weeks, 8 weeks of testing of something that tastes awful every week, or you might find out 4 weeks into it that apples ripen some more and has a really nice flavor, or you really enjoy it cooking in a pie or making applesauce with it or making cider. But just a very something simple to do to just check it out. And remember, just because a tree is a wild tree that wasn't grafted, wasn't planted by somebody, doesn't mean it's not a bad tasting tree. Most varieties of our apples were wild trees at one time that somebody just tasted and figured out, hey, this really is good. And I'm going to start grafting this and I'm going to start, getting the word out about it. So really getting into trees on your property. If you already have trees existing on your property, this is wonderful. The hard work is already done for you. They're tall enough to get out of the browse zone of deer. They've made it through voles and hares, apple borers, weather impacts. So that's wonderful. You've already had a lot of the work done for you by somebody else or by nature. And then you can focus on the more important thing, which is tree care. So what are you going to maintain that tree for? Is it just for wildlife? Is it, hey, this, I want to try using this for an eating apple because somebody planted this before? Or livestock. A lot of people use apples that drop from their wild trees or trees that were planted in the past for livestock. We used to raise rabbits. My wife and I would keep a bunch of barrels of apples in a cool area and we'd feed the rabbits as long as the supply lasted and was good. I know people give them to their pigs, to their horses. Our chickens get some when they start getting a little soft. We bring them out to them. They enjoy them. So, think of different uses, not just for eating on your own. And of course, wildlife, they just care that the apple's there and they'll utilize it. If you get in the planting trees, and I'll show some slides of this in a few minutes, there's a lot more work involved. There's all the planning and preparation. You really have to think, where are you going to put it? How are you going to protect the trees? Can I get water to them to water them? Case in point for myself, every year, the 4 different years in the last 20 years, I planted young apple trees on our properties, always been a dry summer. And it's easy if the trees are near your house and you can reach the hose with it or a short walk with the buckets. But if they're a quarter mile back, do you have the means to take a water barrel out there or a water tank out there and water those trees? So there's a lot of thought there, looking at disease ratings, looking at varieties of apples you want, how quickly they'll produce after they're been planted and have some time to grow. And all that's diligence. And I put it there for 3 times in a row because it really is diligence cubed. You have to think about, how am I maintaining them? How am I protecting them? You got to visit them about every day or every other day when they're young, just to make sure everything's okay. And then seasonally doing changes, which I'll show in a minute about how to protect them. And more importantly, you got to learn to live with loss. Everything, it's like stocking trout if you have a farm pond on your property. You're going to get very protective of them, but everything else is going to come in and want to eat them or, impact them. And it's the same thing with apple trees. You've got apple borers that invade the cambium layer of the tree and can weaken it and cause them to snap over. You've got deer that are browsing, that are causing a lot of damage to those trees. And porcupines, we can go through the list, voles, all kinds of things. So you really have to consider where you're going to do that. The one other aspect of planting trees that's not here is, if you all think of a typical apple orchard you see, the one and most important feature of those commercial apple orchards, if they're 20 years old or 200 years old, is they're typically on a slope, the southeast face to them. And this allows a couple of things. One, growing up on a mountain like myself, my father used to always say, the wind, we have airflow 2 times a day, no matter what. And that's true on hills. As air warms, you have movement of air currents up slope. And then in the evening, when air cools, you have movements downslope. But this helps. Just providing some movement of air helps dry out trees during different times of the year and just allows airflow for better health. There's also the ability with a slope to allow near surface groundwater to move through an area and not pool there. Apple trees do not like wet feet, so to say, because you have all issues with rot and low oxygen and stuff. So that's what you typically see. And I'll show you in a second what I deal with here on my property, but that's one consideration with your site selection. Again, we could talk for a day or two just on planting trees alone. So we'll take a small walk through some apple trees in our dooryard and elsewhere on our property, just to talk about some of these things with establishing trees and protection. So here in our dooryard around some of our outbuildings, we've got a variety of apple trees planted. Some of these trees don't exist anymore because they've got had disease issues, or apple borers took them down. So these trees obviously are guarded going into winter. And right now look pretty good. They've got some shape to them and everything. These are a little more remote on our property. This is not an ideal setting, like I just mentioned. There is no slope. We have our property here that my wife and I have is 140 acres of pancake, literally. And it's kind of ironic for somebody that grew up on a mountain, at the base of the mountain where we lived was 750 feet lower than the top of the mountain at a mile up. So flat ground here, it's nice as we get older, but it's really not great for airflow. So in this area here, we had a small field. We felt that we could easily maintain some apple trees in here and let them do what they may. So these apple trees at the time were probably about the two larger ones you see are 7, 8 years old. In the rest of those areas, there are small apple trees that are getting ready to get planted the following spring. We just prepped the area. So this is 4 foot high pasture fence that's 7 feet on each side, with steel T-posts. This idea is to prevent the deer from reaching in and grabbing young trees. They can browse on some of the branches that move over the fencing, but it's a pretty effective barrier during the non-snow season. We've had a couple years in the past where we've had snow blow into this field, where we've had drifts almost to the top of that fencing. And just imagine getting a crust on that and having, if you still have deer around that time of year, walking through, the trees are very vulnerable then. We could have opted to have electric fencing around this, but the sun exposure is not the best here. So using a large solar powered shock controller for the electric fence wouldn't have worked well. Just a close up here. It's a Vol guard on the bottom of a metal hardware cloth. We put these in the fall to keep the voles away. And then that white paint is actually a mixture of spackle and white latex paint. It's a very simple way annually of treating young trees before the bark gets thicker. And what this does is prevents the apple borer larvae from boring in, and they feed in as galleries all through the cambium layer of the apple tree. Then after between 1 to 4 years, depending on the species, will bore into the heart of the tree roughly, metamorphose, chew their way out as the adult. And many times the trees look healthy, look great, and all of a sudden the tree will just snap over. Then you'll look and you'll see that the tree was completely girdled for the most part, and a very small amount of cambium was left. So those trees were, susceptible to snow events, wind events. Just a close up here. This also is a great barrier too from keeping porcupines from climbing your trees outside the snow season. And if you can make them high enough, even on larger trees, which we do, we'll put them in the fall before winter sets and snow comes, so the porcupines can't, there's still a barrier to the porcupines. So when you fail at protecting your trees, as this case example here, um, you can lose your tree. This is kind of a funny story. This tree was one of our first plantings, and we didn't use those heavy metal T posts. We used the cheaper U posts, which are poor quality metal, thinner. And I was realizing that they were starting to rust and weaken at the interface with the soil. So I said, "Oh, next spring I'm going to go ahead and this was, install a T post and redo it better." Well, that winter, of course, they were very weak. You had about 2 feet of snow, and you could see where a large deer was leaning over the fencing to try to browse this tree. Well, it snapped two of the posts. And I wish we had a camera on it because it probably was quite hilarious when that deer actually fell into the enclosure around the tree. But um, decided, hey, I'm here already, so I can get back out. And it basically ate a 5.5 foot tree down almost to that nub there. I had cut it down about 2 feet, trying to get it to resprout, but gave up on it. Um, a couple other quick considerations when you're looking at your trees and just like deciding about purchasing them. When you're purchasing rootstock or young trees, really look at where these trees were grown, what climate zone, um, and also how these trees are being sent to you. Are they bare rootstock, which means there's no soil? They're dormant, they're young trees, they're shipped that way, the roots are kept warm, or are they in a soil mixture? The reason I say that is if you order trees from Pennsylvania, Missouri, southern states, bring them into Maine, they may not be hardened to our climates, even though the variety would survive here. Also, if you're bringing in potted plants from out of state, you don't know what diseases may occur. There's all kinds of non-native pests and other diseases like bacteria and stuff that could carry along that may not be in Maine or maybe more isolated in Maine. So really think about that. I am not sponsored by anybody, but I've always used Fedco because most of their nursery stock, all their nursery stock is grown by small producers in Maine, which I think is great to support. But the quality of the trees have been fantastic my entire life and dealing with other people that have bought trees from them. And they have great write-ups to describe the varieties and such. And you can use those if you buy them from elsewhere too, but look at what you're buying. Fertilizing. People always ask this question every time I talk to people about apple trees. When you do your initial planting, there is some fertilizing you can do in the hole that the root ball is going into or the root system's going into. Again, a good description there is in Fedco's tree catalog. They actually have a description of what a fruit tree fertilizer mix would be. And it's a good thing to give you some information on. Fertilizing established trees, really, you have to consider what your budget is. But if you were to actually do it to the scale, say for a medium-sized apple tree that's 20 years old, you were to acquire the right nutrients and different mixes, you're probably talking $200 to $300 minimum of cost to fertilize just one tree. I mean, the tree's already established, it's doing well. What you really want to look at is what I would call holistic management. There's a gentleman by the name of Michael Phillips, who was an orchardist out of New Hampshire, um, that was really phenomenal in describing these systems. Unfortunately, he just passed away a few years ago in his early 60s, which was sad. But his books are amazing. I've taken classes with him in the past when he's been up here at MAFCA and everything. But he's looking at the trees as trying to create them as be as healthy as possible. So his aspects are weed control under the trees, um, invigorating and maintaining a very diverse fungal community around the root system of these trees, which trees rely upon so much. So he looks at using um, hardwood wood chips that are placed around every couple of years around the drip edge of a tree where most of the finer roots are on a tree. It's a really interesting concept that he has. He was organic focused, but you can take the principles that he talks about and really utilize some of those components if you're interested in trying to give your trees the best possible conditions to thrive out under. And his whole premise was if you make a tree super healthy, your disease issues are going to be reduced. Um, really interesting concepts. It really makes sense. It's some interesting reading. And one other consideration I didn't put here, and we'll talk about in a second, we go into trying to restore apple trees, is when you're doing the clearing around apple trees, say removal of competing brush, tree species and stuff, some people may use herbicides or may use herbicides for other reasons around apple trees. Be very, very careful because if you get suckering off the root system of apple trees, it's not always close to the stem of the tree sometimes. And I've heard horror stories where people have, oh, I stayed 10 feet away, but for whatever reason, there was a sucker attached to that root system, and they did a spray trying to cut back, say, on invasive plant growth around apple trees, and they've had impacted those trees. It's not often that occurs, but it's something to consider. So let's go and talk about restoring, neglected apple trees on your property. I see this the most with my clients. I do a lot of work on state wildlife management areas. So this is what I see, and I actually enjoy this the most. I never pruned in a commercial orchard setting, nor would I ever want to. I have a good friend in Skowhegan, Jason Davis at Caford Orchards that absolutely loves it, and I use him as my resource on commercial stuff and send people there. But I like playing in the woods, playing with trees that may have been planted at one time or most likely seedling trees that people want to reinvigorate either for wildlife, their own personal use. So this is a perfect example here of a hidden apple tree on the edge of a field, just completely covered by young tree species. And here's one that will show how we release this tree. It's on the edge of a field also. It's leaning out. You can see it. There's an old telephone pole behind it. You've got a mixture of different hardwood species around it and some common buckthorn as an invasive plant there, as well as a few small firs. So the first thing you're going to do is remove that competing species around it. You're basically going to clear to the drip line, so the outer branches of the upper tree. And with that, you're just creating room for it to get sunlight, to get airflow, and give it room to grow. And then once you go to the drip line, go out another 2 to 3 to 5 feet, give it a little more room and a little more airflow, a little more exposure to the sun. Because you think of it, the sun is going to be what allows it to photosynthesize. The sun's going to dry it out in the middle of the winter when we get a wet snow event or an ice event so that the moisture doesn't stay there over long periods of time. And then when you have the tree cleared out with competing species, now you're going to start the pruning aspect. Remember, this tree's been living in a closet, so to say, of darkness. You're going to slowly open up the tree canopy itself to allow more sunlight in. You're not going to do it all in 1 year. So you are going to first look at things that don't really matter. So taking dead wood off that tree. Our dead branches that are persistent on apple trees may impede the growth of live branches. They may rub against them and injure them, which can then cause them to fail. It just allows more opening there in the tree. So those first 1 to 3 years, you're basically getting rid of dead wood. You're shaping the tree. It's leaning really hard one direction. You want to take a little off the end of the lean, try to get some growth on the backside to try to balance the tree some more. It takes multiple winters of pruning and everything. I always say about 3 years, sometimes a little longer, but at a minimum 3 years. When you are working around these apple trees, in doing this initial clearing of competing species and everything, my strong suggestion is to do it in the winter when the tree's dormant. The bark is very tight. It can withstand some damage if you drop trees on it. The two time periods of the year to avoid are bud break in the spring to leaf out. That's when the bark on trees becomes very slippery because it's getting ready to grow. and that bark is loosening up. So as that tree puts on more girth, the bark will move with it. So if you just touch it with a branch lightly or run into it even with the handle of a saw, you can damage the cambium layer. And the other time to really avoid it too is in August. So all of your buds for the following year on most hardwood species in the Northeast are forming in August, be it fruit buds on an apple tree or vegetation buds on an apple tree. And it's also a time period where the root system is having another big movement of growth in the finer root hairs because it's taking in a lot more nutrients, and the tree is more susceptible to damage at that time period. But otherwise, late spring, early summer, after the tree has fully leafed out, you can clear around it. I like winter. There's no ticks. It's cooler. It's a nice time of year. But I know sometimes if your trees are much farther in the woods and you have access issues with snow and everything, that it can't always work on them then. And another example of, restoring trees. This is a small plant orchard behind the Somerset County Extension Office in Skowhegan. All those trees in the foreground are common buckthorn, which is an invasive shrub species. So the first approach to restoring these apple trees was to go in with a brush saw and chainsaw, cut down all the buckthorn. We didn't treat it, but we cut them down, and then had a bunch of high school volunteers lug away probably 8 pickup truck loads of brush to the side of the field to create a pile. And now, annually or every other year, you can go in with a brush saw and very easily keep that buckthorn down. And you can see already how much more light and how much more wind flow can occur through those apple trees before we even prune them. So you get in your property, you look at apple trees, and all the stuff you'll read online or in some of the pamphlets I'm going to highlight here that I think Casey may have shared with you already or will, shows all these nice pictures, either hand drawn or photographs of real trees that show these trees that have good shape and everything. This is what I see a lot. This is up at the Bud Levitt Wildlife Management Area. And this is a tree that is very vigorous. It's a wild tree, looks great. On the left is a little farther away. Most of those branches were alive, so it says that it's not shading itself out yet. But when you get in close, what's the main stem? What do I want to keep? How do I get it to open up? That's really where you got to think. You're going to think about it. You don't make a rush decision if this is your tree. It's been growing here. This is probably a 30 to 40-year-old tree. Give it a little time. Look at it a couple times. Walk around it with a cup of coffee or two on different days, just to design your approach. And when you do have an approach, you're going to see that you can get results out of it. So on the right is the before picture, before I touched it. On the left is the first winter's work on this. The winter before, or 2 years before, a crew had come in, did some thinning of trees around here in the woodlot. They also thinned around marked apple trees. When we look closely, what did I do to that mess of the heart of the tree? You can see it on the left there. I can't make perfect cuts back to collar wood where the healing would be perfect. I just kind of went with what could occur that would allow the tree to be both successful in getting more airflow and sunshine, but also would keep some of those branches supported. Because if you were there in person, some of those branches are mated together and you couldn't remove one without damaging another or one supporting another. So yes, it's not that beautiful textbook version of look what it was before and look what it is now. I'm ready for an orchard. And talking about clearing and pruning tools quickly, power tools are great. I use chainsaws all the time for maybe taking off great big sections of dead wood off of a tree or great big limbs. I always do my final cuts with a handsaw because of the quality of the cut. Brush saws are wonderful for maintaining under apple trees or getting away competing vegetation or saplings when you're starting to thin out around those trees. Power pole saws, for me and a lot of my work, I use those as my first step. It allows a lot of safety for me when I can have a 13-foot power pole saw from the ground. But they're you can cause a lot of damage on a tree. And the gentleman's not on this call, but years ago we did a workshop in Oxford County. The gentleman had worked on some of his trees before we got there. And he's like, "Oh, don't the trees look great and everything?" And his tree did a decent job with the trees. He used a power pole saw, but the problem was he was so focused on the cut he was making on the bottom part of the chain, the bar of the saw, that every time a branch was cut, you could see he'd push it, pull it up. Well, he was forgetting about the limbs above it. So almost every remaining limb on the 3 or 4 trees he worked on had some cutting into it by the chain. Um, and I will say for power pole saws between gas and electric, this year one of my clients had a commercial electric, battery powered pole saw similar to my large gas one. So I use that. And I'm quite impressed by it because the electric saws, just like electric chainsaws, they stop on a dime. So when I'm done with a cut, and I take my finger off the trigger, that electric pole saw would stop instantly. So I like that because I make mistakes. We all get tired, we all slip. So I really like that aspect there of it. I'll eventually replace my gas powered pole saw with an electric, but right now it economically doesn't make sense. When you get into your hand tools, what you use for the smaller limbs, branches, branchlets, you've got a whole host of items, and I'll show some in a second. Hand saws are the most important thing. Um, non-powered pole saw that's extendable, hand pruners, loppers, or a pole pruner are really, very useful tools. So here, looking at hand saws, um, you want to use a saw that is well made and good quality. I use Silky products. They're a Japanese product. They've been around a long time. Their steel is fantastic, but more importantly, their teeth style is excellent. They only cut on a pull stroke, which is nice. So when you push out on the saw, you tend not to be as rigid. Your arm is loose. It's not locked. You can chatter, so to say, when you're making a cut going that way. But when you're pulling back, your arm's locked and it's tighter. You tend to get much crisper lines. You can follow right in the groove easier. Um, I've enjoyed using these saws for 12, 14 years. I have 3 different ones now of different uh, styles. Some are slightly curved, like the top one. The one on the bottom is a straight saw. Um, you can get right into between branches, close to branches you're trying to save with these. They're good holsters you can wear on your belt that protect the blades. I've have some blades I've been using for 8, 9 years, probably tens of thousands of cuts on a blade, and you can't they say you can resharpen them, but there's no way I could ever resharpen them. But they work fantastic. There's some other suppliers, both European and American, that make similar saws. And it's really what your budget is, how often you're going to use it, and how easy it is for you to get replacement parts. Like these models here, the top one, the Zubat, that size there is about $90. A slightly larger one that I use is about 3 inches longer, is about $110, the complete saw. Replacement blades are like $70 to $85. You can see where the cost is. And the blade goes all the way down to the base of the rubber grip. Um, you can get saws as cheap as $35, $40, but it's really what your budget is, how you're going to use it. Um, I only use my apple pruning saws for apple tree work. Um, I use other blades for them if I'm doing pruning on my property for trails, say, or softwoods. On the right are just hand loppers. There's another variety of manufacturers throughout the world. I like Felco's, and there's some other folks too that manufacture them that you can replace everything. I can take apart these hand pruners and I can change out most parts. I like it. They're great to sharpen. Um, I probably do easily 10 to 20,000 cuts a year with these kind of pieces of equipment too. They have a little clip on the sheath that I can put in the back of my belt when I'm working with them. And you can use them for other things around your yard in the off season. I prune my blueberries with them, my raspberries. My wife uses them in all of her pollinator gardens. So you got a lot of other uses just instead of the apple trees there. Um, Other hand tools on top there is just a extendable hand pole saw, which I used in the past a lot, but I found that I could be a lot more productive because of my clients focusing mostly on renovating apple trees for in woodlands for wildlife, that the power one was much safer for me and also allows me to do things a little more quickly, which saves the client some money and also allows me to work through trees more quickly. But also has plenty of other uses if you own something like that on your property too. As well as a pole pruner, which is really great when you start looking at pruning smaller ends of branches from the ground, when you're really getting into the the management part, the maintenance part of pruning a tree after you've established shape and taken big branches out. Um, my only suggestion there is to take and buy what's in your budget and try to buy the little better ends of the items. I know I'm talking a lot and we're getting near the end here. So when you're dealing with pruning, I call it Joe's Law. Other people who teach pruning classes will use their name, but really pruning is 65% science and 35% art. And that's the cool thing about pruning in my mind is we all can do it for the right reasons, but we also can do it a little differently to create interesting shaped trees or trees that, if you're left-handed or right-handed, it'll be a different approach to how you prune. And the whole reason we're pruning is right here. Airflow, sunlight, and room for fruit. That's the whole reason you're doing it. You want the tree to dry quickly after rain events. You want apples to dry when they're growing quickly so they don't get any kind of disease or fungal issues and stuff like that. It's just really important to have that room. There's two sayings. One is a well pruned fruit tree. A bird can fly through in any directions without hitting a limb. There's an older saying that you could throw a cat through a fruit tree without hitting a limb. But the whole idea is creating that room, just making it open. That's the whole thing that you're really looking for there. And don't rush. Take your time with the decisions, like I said earlier. You're dealing with trees that can live 100, 200 plus years. You may be having trees already that are 100 plus years old on your property. If they're living, they're still going. So there's no mad rush to go out there and to change anything. Your pruning timing, most important thing is do it during dormancy. So typically January through bud break, and that's like early spring. And you'll see bud break. There's a phase called silver tip. Basically, when the bud starts, say, waking up in the spring, you start seeing it get a little fuzzier, and you'll start seeing the silver sheen to it. You also, at the same time, will notice that the bark is starting to get a little looser on the trees. When I'm climbing with my bean boots in the winter, I have no damage to the bark. But then suddenly I'll say, yep, it's getting the early April. I can start seeing the buds changing, and suddenly, if I put a little too much weight on my toe, I might see a little damage to the bark. That's about it. We've had years where this occurs in middle of March, so you have to be careful. When you're removing live branches from a tree, 25 to 30% removal of live growth maximum. It's not that you have to meet that, it's that that's your maximum. Sometimes you only can take 20% off and you feel good about a tree. But if you might take a couple of years to get where you want to be with it. And the most important thing is take a workshop. Do it often. I still take workshops because I have a blast learning from other instructors that have different approaches, use different tools. I like learning things like that. It's a great way to experience things, look at problems that you might not encounter, and most importantly, play with the different tools that they have there. Try it before you buy it, kind of thing. Quickly, this was part of the handout. Just how you prune is based upon many aspects of limb angles, bud angles, what you want. In shaping of trees, the big important thing here is you're creating more of a candelabra where you have different rows at different heights, almost like a Christmas tree. Your lowest row would be the widest. The next row up about 2 or 3 feet would be in a little bit, so you're not shading your lower branches that much. Typically, what you see in unmanaged trees, all kinds of branches, back and forth, dead branches, damaged branches. There's bittersweet vines in here. There's grapevines growing through it. You got plenty of stuff to do on this tree. Again, a close-up of Asiatic bittersweet. Definitely something you want to remove from your trees and to cut off at the ground. The one thing with vines, um, don't pull them. Just cut them off at the ground. Cut them off as high as you can. Don't try being He-Man or He-Woman and yanking on the vine. I've seen half trees come down when people have done this that are dead. Or a lot of times what happens is you're yanking on something and you'll break that really nice branch that you want to keep later on when you're pruning or shaping the tree. Don't worry about it. As long as the vine's dead, it will break down. It's not going to damage the tree anymore. Just some young trees that need more attention, starting to open up some, need bottom limbs taken off in the next year. The snow there is about 3 feet, believe it or not. This is many winters ago. And then just other places for assistance. University of Maine Extension Office has a phenomenal publication, which I think Casey's provided to people about, restoring and dealing with apple trees and maintaining them. Soil and water conservation districts often can provide you information, have workshops on pruning and other aspects of apple trees. MOFGA is a phenomenal one. They always have their pruning weekend, which is coming up, I believe, next weekend or this weekend. And they'll have multiple classes all over the state. They have grafting classes. They have their apple meetup. They're a really great resource there, um, full of information. Local orchards are another one too, is learning from those folks. And one other thing to look at is for whatever reason, the British Royal Horticultural Association or Society, they have tons of videos on this because they're just gaga about pear trees and fruit trees, mainly for cider production, but they have great videos. And with that, I will quiet down and ask if there's any questions. Thank you for staying on.